Okay, you are so annoying, cat. I have the cats out today. I decided I'm not doing this quite like the way I prefer to do it. I didn't get things set up the way I normally prefer to for today. So the cats are free. They are out in the living room, ready to cause trouble. I have a cat here, as you can see the tail of the cat. This is a big fat cat, and the troublemaker is up there ready to pounce at any moment. So we're going to have the cats out today. First time in a while I've had the cats out while I'm doing with this. But like I said, I was not able to get myself set up properly this time. I developed kind of a nice little routine for doing this, which usually involves keeping the cats in the bedroom for their afternoon naps. But I didn't have the luxury of doing that today because I wasn't here this morning. And I need to get this done. I really want to get this video done before, before. The next couple of weeks are going to be extremely busy for me, and I am not going to be able to do any more videos probably until the middle of June. This is May 31st. Now, it won't matter to anyone watching these videos. Okay, as of May 31st, 2022, which is today, I'm now going to be doing the Hezekiah chapters in Kings and Chronicles. So 2 Chronicles 30 and 2 Kings 20 or thereabouts. In my actual uploading of the videos, I'm still back in Joshua. I haven't even made it out of the first 6 books of the Bible when it comes to my uploading of the videos. So by the time I get around to uploading these, it'll probably be a year from now. And it won't matter to anybody actually watching these videos. But today is May 31st, 2022, and the next couple of weeks are going to be extremely busy. And I'm not even going to be here for the second week of June, third week of June, anyway. And so I'm probably not going to be able to do anything or get any videos done. The next material after this is going to be Isaiah. And unlike the other prophets I've read so far, the shorter ones, Isaiah is a very long book. And we're not going to be getting that done today. So I'm thinking I probably won't even bother starting Isaiah until after I get back from my vacation in the second week of June. Actually, it's more like the third week of June. So I hardly will be doing any more of these for all. So today, we're going to be focusing on the Hezekiah chapters of Kings and Chronicles, as well as Isaiah. We're going to actually be reading out of the book of Isaiah again today for part of this, to get us a full biblical picture of the reign of Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah is very well attested outside of Scripture. In fact, this entire time frame is very well attested outside of Scripture. Hezekiah is going to have a rival, a guy by the name of Sennacherib, who is the king of Assyria. And Sennacherib left us his own writings of the same period of time, talking about many of the same events that the Bible is going to be talking about here, because Hezekiah and Sennacherib are going to have a feud, and their countries are going to be at war with each other, and each country left records behind of its version of events of that war. And so we have a lot of information, extra biblical, outside scriptural information about Hezekiah in this time frame. Unfortunately, all this extra information doesn't necessarily help us piece together the chain of events. That cat is so annoying. I fed you, Lily. You don't need to do this. Because, you have to remember, the Bible is an ancient document. It is propaganda, okay? Like, it's reporting the events, I think, accurately. But it's definitely doing so with an agenda, okay? It's not inaccurate or unfair to say that the Bible writers had an agenda when they wrote their writings. You can even see that when you compare the differences between Kings and Chronicles and the different focuses that the writers of Kings and Chronicles had, or the Gospels. Now, it is true that the Bible's propaganda is a lot different than the propaganda of the rest of the world. And you can tell the difference there when you compare the way the Bible talks about its kings compared to the way the other nations talk about their kings. The scriptures seem to be focused more than anything on recording the king's failures, or the people's failures. Whereas that is not the way that other nations around them talked about their kings. And that's not the way the kings talked about themselves. And ancient writing was entirely propagandistic in nature, just all of it, military, religious, civil. It was all about establishing greatness and dominance over the other nations. But the Bible, more or less, focuses mainly on the people's failures and their successes. We have some fuzziness with the chronology here. When it comes to Hezekiah, I'll talk about it as we go, but the dating for Hezekiah is fuzzy. It's tricky, okay? The way the scripture records his dates is kind of weird, and we're going to have to keep that in mind. So we'll talk about it even here as we get going. We're going to actually start in the Chronicles this time. Okay, I usually begin reading through Kings, and then I flip back to Chronicles and read the Chronicles account afterwards. Kings was written first, and it's more history focused, should I say. For Kings is more written about the Kings' focus is more about just writing down what happened, and then explaining afterwards how the failures of the kings led to the collapse of the country, north and south. Chronicles is more about tracking the development of the kingship through the reign of David and the promise of David afterwards, and how that is still applicable even in the chronicler side, because the chronicler is writing after the exile and after the return from exile, and it's focused on uplifting the people and demonstrating to them why the promises God made to David are still active and have not faded away, have not been canceled. So the Chronicles is kind of more theological in nature, not to say the Kings isn't, but it's kind of more focused on showing why the kingship, even though they don't have a king in the Chronicler's day, that promise God made to David is still active and has not been canceled. Whereas Kings is more kind of focused on just like laying bare the sordid history of what happened. So and Kings was written first. And so Chronicles, I think, use Kings as a source. So I usually start with Kings because I think it has kind of primacy of importance, being an older book and a more direct account of what happened. But today I'm actually starting with Chronicles because Chronicles, I tend to like to read these as close as I can to chronological order to the greatest degree possible. And Chronicles has some information from the very beginning of Hezekiah's reign that Kings does not have. So we're going to be starting with 2 Chronicles 29. I'm just going to read the first couple of verses and I'm going to start a new video. Hezekiah was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. So he's one of the good kings. In fact, he's one of the best kings. He's one of the three best kings of Israel. You've got David, the standard bearer for the good kings, and Hezekiah, and then the guy coming up named Josiah. And those are like the three best. We had Jehoshaphat and Asa also that were in the top tier. And then we have a lot of middling kings and then some really bad ones. Okay, so Hezekiah, before I go on and actually start reading this, I'm going to go ahead and make a new video when I do that. But for now, I'm going to set more context for Hezekiah's day. Hezekiah's years as sole king of Israel, like the sole monarch, from what we can tell, are 715 BC to 686 BC. That's 29 years. But he became a co-regent with his father Ahaz, who was a wicked king, one of the worst, probably the worst they'd had up to this point in time. He became a co-regent with his father Ahaz at some point before that. I don't know exactly when. Maybe even as early as like in the early 720s BC. But he became sole rule. So the 29-year figure of his sole rule starts at 715. This is actually pretty important because the timeline of Hezekiah is pretty tight. Okay, he's going to have an illness coming up along the way where he's about to die. He gets some sort of disease, illness, which is fatal apparently. He's going to die, and he prays to God, and God restores his life, or his health, and extends his life by another 15 years. Okay, well, simple math tells you that if he lived 15 years after that, and he reigned 29 years total, then that happened when he was in basically his 14th or 15th year as king. Okay? And that also happens to be right around the same time his big showdown with Sennacherib happened, Sennacherib being the king of Assyria at that time. It seems as though his illness happened just a little bit before that. While he is sick, or just after he gets better, he is going to receive messengers from Babylon, which is a kingdom far to the east of Assyria, actually, southeast of Assyria. And they're going to come and talk to Hezekiah and, congratulate him on getting over his illness, and he's going to receive them into his palace. The text doesn't specifically say this, but it's likely that the messengers from Babylon are hoping to make an agreement with Hezekiah to be part of an anti-Assyrian alliance, which apparently Hezekiah agrees to. Again, the Bible text doesn't actually say this, but it does talk about him receiving these visitors and showing them all of this stuff. We know from the context of these passages, as well as some references in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah was a contemporary of Hezekiah. In fact, he was Hezekiah's prophet. He ministered to Hezekiah as king. That Hezekiah also made an alliance, or tried to at least, was discussing it, with Egypt. So Hezekiah had a tendency to try to make alliances with other nations. He was a faithful king. In fact, like I said, he was one of the 2 or 3 best kings. But he does seem to have put, at least at the beginning of his reign, he does seem to have put some of his faith in other kings and other nations, as they were all everybody hated Assyria. I mean, Assyria were the villains. Everybody hated them. Everybody hated Assyria. Everybody wanted to team up against Assyria and destroy Assyria. Now, Hezekiah inherited a vassal relationship with Assyria. If you remember his father Ahaz, who was a wicked king, one of the worst kings, probably the worst king that Judah had had up to that point, had made an alliance with Assyria. He paid tribute to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria at the time. And against Isaiah's, we read a section in Isaiah about him talking to Ahaz about this. And Ahaz did not want to trust in God, did not want to trust in Jehovah. He already probably had made up his mind that he was going to form an alliance with Assyria. He's going to pay Assyria to beat off Israel and Syria, the 2 nations north of him. And they did. Assyria did do that. And Assyria would end up destroying both those nations. They destroyed Syria first and then destroyed Israel a little bit later. We read about that already. But they didn't destroy Judah at the time, but they did make Judah a vassal state. And that was done in the years of King Ahaz. Hezekiah inherits this condition. He inherits this vassal state relationship with Assyria. I'm not entirely certain when Hezekiah came to the throne as co-regent with Ahaz, and I'm not clear on how much authority he had. He may have been a very young person. Like I said, he was apparently 25 years old when he became king, sole king. So if he had been made co-regent years before that, we're talking about a kid here. Maybe a teenager, maybe even earlier than that. I'm not really sure. So he wouldn't have had a lot of authority, if any at all, at first. But Hezekiah was a good man and a good king, and he apparently, as soon as possible, as soon as he becomes sole king, or as soon as he puts his father out of the way, he tries to get the nation to go back to God again. But he does seem to have also entertained these alliances with other nations, Egypt and Babylon, to fight against Assyria. Now, it took a while, apparently, for Assyria to turn its attention to fighting Hezekiah. Assyria's primary enemy, okay, remember, Assyria is northeast of Israel. Okay, you have Judah and Israel, which were once one kingdom. Israel was the northern half of that kingdom. Right north of Israel was Aram. We were called today Syria. Its capital city was Damascus. And then northeast of Syria was Assyria. And then southeast, down the Euphrates River, it was on the Assyria was centered like on the northern part of the Euphrates River, and then downstream in the southern part, where it empties out into the Gulf, was Babylon. And Babylon and Assyria are both ancient kingdoms. Nimrod, we read about back in Genesis 10, Nimrod established both of them. He's established the cities that would eventually become the capital cities of Assyria and Babylon. So these are old kingdoms, and they had periods of, if you read ancient history books, you'll read about the old Assyrian period, the old Babylonian period, going back to the 1000s plus BC. So they were old kingdoms with long histories, and they would come and go as time went on. Sometimes they would come up and be prosperous, and then they would decline, and then they would come back again, and they would decline again. And they never liked each other. Assyria and Babylon were enemies who hated each other and hated each other. So Assyria's main enemy was Babylon. Assyria's main enemy wasn't Israel or Judah. Their enemy was Babylon, which was to their southeast. And Babylon hated Assyria. Babylon will eventually destroy Assyria. In 612 BC, Babylon will finally win this centuries-old conflict and will destroy and utterly annihilate Assyria. We're about 100 years away from that still. Right now, Assyria are the big kids on the block, and they're beating everybody up, and they're beating Babylon, they're beating Israel and Judah. And Babylon is trying to fight Assyria, but is not really succeeding. But they're causing enough trouble that Assyria frequently has to turn its attentions to fighting Babylon, and that's why Assyria kind of comes and goes during this time. And while sometimes they come upon Judah and attack Judah, and then sometimes they don't. Because when they're not attacking Judah, they're busy elsewhere. Most likely busy with Babylon. They could be busy to the north too sometimes. Everybody hated Assyria. Assyria hated enemies. Everybody hated them. Everybody hated Assyria, and Assyria hated everybody. So they were always going around somewhere and fighting somebody. So when they're not attacking Judah, it's because they're somewhere else attacking somebody else during that time period. So Hezekiah has a few years at the beginning of his reign in which Assyria is not bothering him, and in fact he is having to pay tribute to Assyria to kind of carry on it, because his father established a vassal relationship with Assyria, which Hezekiah inherits. Eventually he is going to rebel against this and stop paying tribute, and that will cause the king of Assyria to come to him. And this will happen like at the time, now in Assyria, okay, the guy that Ahaz dealt with was a guy named Tiglath-Pileser. He was the guy that comes along and starts attacking. He kind of rebuilds Assyria. Assyria had been going through a downstretch earlier in the century, the 700s BC. That's what Jonah was talking about. Jonah was talking probably in the days when Nineveh and Assyria were kind of in a downturn. Then in 745 BC, a guy named Tiglath-Pileser III, or Pul, as he's called in the Bible, comes along and reestablishes Assyrian dominance and begins another campaign for Syrian conquest. And he lasts until 727 BC. And he dies. And he has a guy named Shalmaneser who comes along, Shalmaneser V, who comes along and becomes king. And he only reigns for about 5 years. And he's the one who besieges Samaria. Shalmaneser is the king of Assyria who comes upon Samaria in the days of Hoshea, the last king of Israel. And he attacks it and besieges it. He does not finish the destruction of the city, though. He dies in that battle, possibly assassinated by one of his men or his brothers. Possibly dies in the battle, I'm not sure. But he does not actually finish the conquest of Samaria. He basically does everything but mop it up, the after effects. Because he dies right around the same time Samaria falls. He may have died in the battle. He may have died at the hands of his brother or one of his men as a betrayal or assassination. Anyway, he dies in 722 BC, which is the same year as the northern kingdom of Israel falls. And some guy called Sargon comes along. And that's it. By the way, Sargon, I'm just going to say, Sargon is a great evil king name. I don't know if there's ever been a king in history who's had just a more appropriately sounding evil king name than Sargon. What sort of character? What do you think of when you think of the name King Sargon? You think of a bad guy. That's what you think of. Anyway. So a guy named Sargon, I believe this is Sargon II, takes over. He might have even killed Shalmaneser, I'm not sure. And he reigns as king from 722 BC down to 705 BC. And then he dies, and a guy called Sennacherib comes along. And Sennacherib reigns from 705 BC down to 681 BC. And Sennacherib is the guy that Hezekiah deals with. And when Sargon dies, there's a bit of a mutiny going on. And all the nations that had been under Assyrian dominance or Assyrian influence tried to rebel because everybody hates Assyria. And so Sennacherib is busy then for the first part of his reign going around and trying to quell all these rebellions. Mostly successfully. Mostly. Okay. Sennacherib also left extensive information about his own campaign and his own exploits, which we've recorded on 3 separate blocks of stone that have words written on them called the Sennacherib prisms. And there's 3 of them, and they all say the same things. And so he recounts a lot of the same information that we're going to read about here in Kings and Chronicles and Isaiah. Of course, he has a different perspective, he has a different slant, and he has a different version of the ending. But a lot of this stuff is corroborated by Sennacherib's own first-hand account. And that is basically the context of what's going on here. We have Hezekiah coming to the throne as a sole ruler in 715 BC, inheriting a vassal relationship with Assyria, which was started by his father Ahaz. And then he initially focuses on reforming his own kingdom and getting them to turn back to God. I think it seems to me like he's okay with accepting the status quo with Assyria for the time being in order to focus on getting his own people right with God again. At some point later on, Assyria weakens through the death of Sargon, and a mutiny comes up, and these different kingdoms are trying to make alliances with each other, including Judah, who apparently tries to make an alliance with Egypt. And then, we don't really read directly about Hezekiah reaching out to Egypt. We can infer that based on the context. We don't really have that written explicitly for us here. But we do read about him entertaining the envoys from Babylon. And that happens in the context of his illness, which happens 15 years before his death, which is what the text itself states. He died in 686 BC, which means that his illness had to happen 701 or 702 BC, which is right around the time Sennacherib came. Probably right before, like right at the beginning of Sennacherib's invasion that happened. Babylon was rebelling at the time, and Babylon has a guy that's going to be a nuisance to Assyria and Sennacherib, and they're trying to make an alliance with Hezekiah, and so that's why they're there. And so that is the context. And then Isaiah the prophet is also here. Isaiah the prophet ministers throughout this time period. And so a lot of this information probably, we read some of this stuff is actually directly copied from Kings and Isaiah. So he was probably the court prophet or court historian that wrote down a lot of this information that ended up getting included into these history books originally. And so that is the content. And so a lot of Isaiah's book, the 66 chapters of Isaiah's book, a good chunk of those are going to be about this time period. Okay, so now we're going to actually start reading.